My connection to Cuba is through my mother. My mother was born in Havana, Cuba in 1924. Her parents had escaped from the Ukraine during the pogroms when the Jews were being persecuted. They escaped. They ended up in an Eastern European country where a Jewish agency placed them on a ship to come to the United States or another country. At that particular point in time, the United States had a quota for Jews, so they could not get into the United States. So they ended up in Havana. They didn't speak a word of Spanish. It was a completely foreign culture for them. They didn't have any money, and they didn't know anybody there. So I heard the stories that my mother would tell when we were growing up. One story was that when my grandparents got off the ship, they required that every person who disembarked had at least $7. But nobody had $7. So what they would do is they would take the money that they had, they'd show it, and then they'd sneak it to the person behind them. So everybody was using the same dollar bill or peso, whatever it might have been, so that they could get off the boat. My grandfather didn't have any particular skill. He learned how to sew. He borrowed a sewing machine from a woman who sewed during the day, and he asked her if he could borrow it at night. And he learned how to sew, and he first started sewing underwear, and he eventually started making Cuban shirts, which are called guayaberas, which you still see today. They're kind of square shirts. They have panels. They're short sleeve. They go over the pants. And he developed a very successful shirt company. So my mother was born. Her first language was Yiddish, because that's what they spoke in the house. Her second language was Spanish, and her third language was English. She came to the United States when she was 16. She was a very smart young woman, and she came to the United States to go to college. She went to Goucher for a couple of years, and then she met my dad, and they got married. And my father didn't speak a word of Spanish, but my grandparents were still living in Havana. And after I was born, we used to go down to Cuba and visit my grandparents at least once a year. And I have amazing pictures of my family standing in front of the Hotel Nacional, which still exists today, which is still an operating hotel. We have pictures of us in Varadero Beach, which is a very famous beach. Lots of tourists go there today. Gorgeous, gorgeous blue water and sand. My mother kept all her Cuban friends, so I would hear my mother babbling on the telephone in Spanish all the time. And then after Castro came, many of my mother's friends had to leave Cuba, and they left behind their professions, they left behind their money. Some of them were big-time attorneys, and they would come stay at our house for months at a time because they had nowhere to go, they had no livelihood, so we would kind of house them until they got resettled and they could find jobs. My mother was famous for having a Cuban party every year. She would invite all her Cuban friends. We'd have Cuban music, and it was a very festive occasion. My mother lived a very long, fulfilling life, and her Cuban heritage was an incredibly important part of her life and my life. Over the past 10 to 15 years, there's been a small group of us here in Denver that have some connection to Cuba. We get together regularly. We enjoy drinking mojitos. We enjoy eating plátanos, which is a very Cuban dish, arroz con pollo, frijoles con arroz. So we call ourselves the Cuban Mafia, and we're quite a force to be reckoned with. But even here in Denver, there are a number of very strong Cuban folks.